A few years ago, I went to a blind test screening at my local cinema. I had no idea what film I was about to watch going in, but by the time the credits rolled 2 hours later, I had been exposed to a new area of cinema I previously had no idea existed. The film I saw was American Animals, and it was the first docufiction hybrid film I ever saw. At the time, I thought this film was revolutionary. Having never seen anything like it, I assumed something like this had never been done before. Little did I know, the pioneers of this unique style of film emerged in post-revolutionary Iran. New Iranian cinema, or the Iranian New Wave, can be broken down into 3 different periods. Beginning in 1969 with films like The Cow, these films were a reaction to popular cinema at the time, which often lacked a true representation of society. These films were often political and dealt with real societal issues. Beginning after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, films from the second wave were heavily influenced by European art films, such as the French New Wave and, in particular, Italian neorealism. Films from this time period often blurred the lines between documentary and fiction. There is not much that thematically separates the second and third wave of new Iranian cinema. Anything post-1999 could be considered the third wave. It could be argued that the third wave is still ongoing today. The films I'm going to discuss in this video can be described as Iranian Hybrid Cinema, and they originated during around the second wave, the period, I would argue, which has had the most influence on global cinema and Western directors in particular. Much like Italian neorealism was born out of a drastic shift in the social and political climate post-World War II, the second wave of new Iranian cinema began emerging after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Perhaps this is why there are so many similarities between the two. Much like neorealism, many Iranian hybrid films also feature non-professional actors, deal with everyday people and events, and have a distinct flair for realism. Where the two differ is in how much further Iranian cinema pushed the limits of representing reality. The best way I can describe it is this: if there was a scale with documentary at one end and fiction at the other, neorealism would sit somewhere here. And like every other category on this scale, it would stay in that position and not move. An Iranian hybrid film is constantly fluctuating from one end of this scale to the other during the film. With this in mind, let's look at some films from this movement. Directed by Abbas Kiarostami, this film reenacts real events that took place in the late 80s. It follows Hossein Sabzian, a man who impersonated famous Iranian filmmaker Mohsen Makhmalbaf, and tricked a family into believing he would put them in his next film. Kiarostami heard about this after reading an article in the magazine Soroush, and immediately began production on a film about Sabzian. The film follows 2 core sequences. The first is a reenactment of the events that lead up to Sabzian's arrest. What makes these reenactments interesting is that everyone involved plays themselves. The actual family that was tricked, along with Sabzian himself and the journalist who wrote the original article, all reenacted these actual events for the film. At times, we even see them discussing how it actually happened the first time in order for them to properly reenact that moment for the film. This takes the neorealistic trope of using non-actors to the extreme. Not only did Kiarostami use non-actors, but he used the actual people to recreate events that actually happened. The second core sequence of the film, that runs parallel to the reenactments, is the trial that took place. This is footage of the real trial as it actually happened. Leading up to this, we see a number of scenes where Kiarostami is preparing for this. We see him speak to Sabzian in jail, we see him getting his trial moved up, and we see him persuading the judge to allow him to record the trial for his film. Whilst these scenes are reflexive and include the director himself, the scenes of the trial are fly on the wall, and we simply observe what is going on. After the trial, Makhmalbaf, the filmmaker Sabzian impersonated, picks him up on his motorcycle and gives him a lift back to the family's house. What the film does so well is its seamless transitions between different documentary and fiction techniques. The story is brilliantly crafted in such a way that it is not retelling a past story to an audience, it is directly involving them in it as it unfolds. The next film I want to talk about is A Moment of Innocence. This film was directed by our old friend Mac Melbuff and was made 6 years after Close Up. It pushes the hybridization of documentary and fiction to its very limits, but before we get into that, a little history. When he was 15, Mac Melbuff became involved in a militant group fighting the rule of the government. When he was 17, he stabbed a police officer at a protest and was imprisoned and sentenced to death. After 5 years in prison, he was released following the Iranian Revolution and went on to become a successful filmmaker. Years later, the police officer who he had stabbed reached out to Mac Melbuff, asking to act in one of his films. This inspired him to write a film about the incident. He called it A Moment of Innocence. This film is not simply a recreation of the time Mac Melbuff stabbed a police officer. It is so complex that in explaining it to you, I run the risk of complicating things further. This film is about the production of another film, the recreation of these events. We follow present-day Mac Melbuff and the police officer, who each recruit a younger actor to play themselves in the film. They coach and direct these actors in order to properly recreate the scene the way they remember it. We also follow Mac Melbuff as he prepares to shoot the film. He needs to cast a young woman to play his old friend and recruits the daughter of that actual person to play this part. Don't be fooled though. As much as this film presents itself as a documentary, it is entirely scripted. To me, this makes the film even more interesting. Unlike Close Up, where we do see actual events unfold, A Moment of Innocence shows us scenes that present themselves as documentary when they are in fact fictional. In fact, whilst Kiarostami had everyone play themselves in his film, Mac Melbuff is the only person to do so in A Moment of Innocence, with every other character portrayed by an amateur actor. Even the police officer who asked to be in one of the films didn't get to play himself, instead being portrayed by an actor who can be seen auditioning for the part in Hello Cinema, a film Mac Melbuff made from audition tapes after receiving a huge amount of interest in a newspaper advert looking for actors. A Moment of Innocence is an incredibly complex film, which on paper should not make sense, but on screen creates an engaging film and a completely unique way of telling a story. Both of these films were incredibly well received internationally. Close Up is frequently referred to as the greatest Iranian film of all time and was voted among the top 50 films of all time in the 2012 Sight and Sound Critics poll. A Moment of Innocence was ranked 235th among all films in that same poll, making it tied for the second best Iranian film of all time alongside The House is Black. These hybrid films have had a huge influence on modern Western filmmaking. The Safdie brothers, who directed the critically acclaimed Good Time and Uncut Gems, put Close Up among their top 5 favourite films in an interview with Far Out. The popularity of docufiction hybrid films is only increasing, with more and more examples being produced in the West. This brings us back to American Animals. Directed by Bart Layton, this film was released in 2018 and centres around a group of students who stole some extremely rare books from the library of Transylvania University in Lexington. Cutting between interviews with the actual people involved and dramatic reenactments of the event, this film analyses the different memories these people have of the same event and presents us with all possible scenarios. At times, the film brings the real people involved into the reenactments, sometimes even talking to their past selves. If this doesn't sound like the perfect modern version of hybrid cinema, then I don't know what does. Interestingly, American Animals marketed itself as a based on a true story kind of crime drama, completely omitting the interviews from all of the trailers. Does this mean that a general audience is still reluctant to see a hybrid film? That's not for me to say, but one thing is for certain. Without the revolutionary work of Kiarostami and Mac Melbuff, the hybrid film may have never caught on in the first place.